Hello, everyone. This is a screen recording of the intro notes to our section over the 1920s. That'd be chapter 12 and 13 in our current textbook. Um, this is a section that's kind of an interim section for us to deal with. We won't be, at least right now, taking any kind of test over this section. We'll probably just include questions from this unit on our final exam. Um, the 1920s are a very interesting time period for a number of reasons. And in particular, what I want to address first is this idea or this question. And the question I have for you is this the first modern age? And what would make the 1920s modern? And one of the things to focus on is I always think that if you were to be taken back into the time of the 1920s, as opposed to, say, going back to, say, like the 1880s or the 1890s, I think for most people today, you could still pretty much, you would feel yourself be able to maybe fit into the 1920s. Whereas if you went back a lot, maybe 2 decades earlier, or that would be much more difficult. And one of the reasons I think about that is that it's modern for a number of reasons. Um, First of all, electricity was widely available in urban areas by the 1920s. The automobile was widely available um, in terms of kind of living in a modern type of home. You had um, refrigerators available, washing machines available, vacuum cleaners made available, all run with the new technology of electrical power that was made available across the country. Certainly in the urban areas, maybe not yet within the rural areas. That will come quite a bit later. And then you add into the ideas of what had taken place in terms of entertainment. You had modern new sports franchises that were providing mass entertainment, um, professional baseball, professional football, college football. Um, Information was made available through the introduction of radios, and then also with the modern age of the cinema, beginning with movies becoming a big part of the 1920s. So, in many ways, it was a time period that was very transformational, and the aspect of it being a modern time is very important. Not only was technology changing and life in general becoming more modern, life was also becoming a lot more um, liberal in nature, and that's a big component of understanding the 20s as well. Some of the things to think about in the 1920s in terms of the way that the world was changing, and particularly in the United States, is that 1920, that year, is the first year that more people in the United States lived in urban areas than lived in rural areas. And life in the urban areas make the country quite a bit different. Um, Millions of people were leaving rural areas each year between 1922 and 1929, as you can see the statistics here. And that's a trend, of course, that continues still today, that rural populations in the United States are still shrinking. So we see in the 1920s the really evident shift of the way cities were becoming the wave of the future and part of the modern age that we live in today. And certainly, life in cities changes dramatically the way that people see the world. One of the things about living in cities is that this idea of living in a large group of people, you become, in some ways, kind of a possible, kind of a nameless individual that if you want to, you can, you live kind of under the radar the way that you want to without a lot of people judging you versus the idea of living in a small rural area where people knew you, saw you all the time, knew what you were doing. You had very little privacy, whereas in cities you could become, literally kind of lost in a crowd. And as a result, it changes the manners and attitudes of people. Cities allowed people, the life in the cities allowed people to be a lot more free and have new ideas, ways of thinking, and in probably many cases be more adaptive to change, whereas rural areas maintain that sense of conservative values that we still see today as one of the big differences between liberal city populations and much more conservative rural populations in the United States. And that's one of the things that is a key difference between rural and urban areas in terms of voting patterns, in terms of attitudes about religion, attitudes about sex, attitudes about many different components of life that you see that is different between rural versus urban areas. Another major change in the 1920s is the advent of widespread ownership of automobiles. The automobile had been invented earlier in the 20s, but by the 1920s it becomes very, very much a part of American culture, and that has really shaped the way America is today. Some of the changes that happen as a result of the automobile is that there's a lot of changes in terms of family relationships and social standards. For example, family relationships where you used to have, say, young people going out or not really dating, um, that young people would probably meet at their parents' home and have a nice, kind of evening gathering before the young man would go home to his own family. Versus with the advent of the automobile, one thing that happened in the 20s is that kind of the modern concept of going out on a date, where young people would get in a car and drive miles potentially to a dance or out to a movie at another town. And there's a lot more freedom involved with that, and kind of the changes in the way social standards are seen, what is appropriate behavior in terms of the interaction between a dating couple, and also even like on one of the things with family relationships that they say happened as a result of the automobile was that church attendance went down, because on Sundays families would have that day off from work and they would choose to go like on a Sunday drive for a picnic lunch or something where you would be using your car as a way to go out and have a new form of entertainment. That kind of changed the way social structures were and what was expected of people. In other ways, it also changed, just the way the nation looked. Road construction boomed dramatically during the 1920s as more and more people owned automobiles. Auto-related businesses, all sorts of types of drive-in businesses, drive-in gas stations and banks, and all in restaurants, all the different things that we think of today that are part of our car culture really had its beginnings in the 1920s. And that's a tremendous change for the country. Most of the cars in the world were owned but in the United States. We became certainly a nation that was focused around automobiles. And another thing that happened is that transportation changed dramatically around the country in terms of city transportation. There were still railroad lines and trolley lines in cities, but those began to diminish more and more, and until by the 1950s, 30 years later, most cities, medium-sized cities, got rid of those. Topeka, for example, used to have trolley lines that ran through the city, connecting downtown to Gage Park, but by the use of automobiles, those things no longer became necessary. So it changed the way dramatically cities looked and the way transportation took place in a lot of cities, especially medium and small cities. Um, Urban sprawl is directly connected with automobile um, usage too, because the reason for suburbs that grew up around cities was really because people had access to live in the outside kind of semi-rural areas or suburbs, and then they could drive into occupations in cities, and you could kind of get away from the crampedness, the cramped, packed in cities to more open suburban areas. And collectively, we call the growth of suburbs and the spread of cities is known by the term urban sprawl. One of the other major social changes of the 1920s that we'll focus on in this unit is the changing role of women during this time. And the big change that legally takes place during the 20s is that women gain the right to vote by the passage of the 19th Amendment. Women had been working for the right to vote for years and years, going back to the early years of our country. And some of the names that you see here, like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, They were some of the key leaders in the earlier part of the 1800s. The fight for women to gain the right to vote had kind of been diminished during the time of the Civil War with the fight to end slavery, and women kind of gave up their struggle in order to work more to end slavery in the country. And as a result, their struggle for voting rights, or what is known as suffrage, was really took a back seat for several decades. But by the early 1900s, that movement had gained strength again. And some of the leaders that we're going to talk about later on in this unit, because we'll likely watch a movie about them, would be leaders like Carrie Chapman Catt. And the picture in this upper right hand corner is Alice Paul. Um, Both her, Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and Carrie Chapman Catt were very active in the early 1900s in terms of gaining women the right to vote. So we'll look at their struggle a little bit later, but this, of course, is a major change of the 20s. And another aspect of the changing role of women that's synonymous with the 20s is the rise of the female role um, that is known as the flapper. Flappers are significant in terms of the way women are seen in the 20s because they lived a much more free and kind of liberated life than earlier women in American history. These are depictions of the way a flapper would look. You see them kind of characteristically dressed in a shorter skirt where you could see their knees, their um, calves, their ankles. Um, but then it's almost like a double type of change because women were kind of counteracting the way women had been viewed earlier. Women wore shorter skirts because in the past women had been really kind of forced to wear longer skirts. Women began to cut their hair short, as you can see in both these pictures, whereas in the past women rarely cut their hair. They would wear it up in buns if they wanted it up, or braids, but they would not cut their hair. For example, I remember my pictures of my grandmother, and my mother and father said that their mothers never cut their hair. They never saw them get it trimmed. They just wore it up. So you had this kind of counteraction of let's wear shorter, more revealing clothing to kind of act more independent, and then let's cut our hair to make ourselves look different than the women before us. And in some cases, you can see how the dresses were very straight, almost like a boyish kind of look, where women would like even try to reduce the size of their breasts in terms of like making themselves look a little bit less feminine and more boyish in that aspect. And that's kind of the way a flapper would depict themselves. This is like a flapper. These pictures from the late 1800s, this is the way women, a lot of times were presented in terms as being beautiful, with wearing corsets to bind in your waist, to enhance your breast, to thin your waist, to enhance your hips, and then contrast that with the way women were dressing in the 1920s with this flapper look as kind of the new modern way that women should be viewed. Women smoked and drank and really started to see themselves as much more independent and freer than in the past. So these are some of the depictions of women from the time period connected to um, the danger of women making these changes, and these are all particularly associated with women's suffrage. So you can see some of the wording on these of how men are being encouraged to see women getting the right to vote and being more free as a menace to the home, as it says here. Here's a headquarters of an organization opposed to women gaining the right to vote. Here's a pamphlet that's put out by the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage that shows the reasons why it would be dangerous for women to vote, that it's not necessary, and that basically they would kind of cancel out the votes of their husband. So it's kind of a fear tactic used to make men believe that women should not vote. And I think this one's kind of funny. This is a baby crying because his mother has become a suffragette. Suffragettes is what they called the young women that were struggling to gain the right to vote. Um, and that this article says that men would become a subject sex, meaning that women would be in charge and that the nation would no longer be led by the men of the country, but by women, which would be dangerous. Um, and then finally, I think this one's kind of funny too. Here's the hen going off to vote and to leave the country, why the poor old rooster is left behind to take care of the eggs, to take care of the children, because America has been taken over and feminized. So these are just a few of the changes taking place in the 1920s, all a part of the dramatic social changes that we'll discuss more at a later time. This is just kind of an introduction to the way the country was starting to change and evolve.